Now, escalating violence in Cabo Delgado province in northern Mozambique. It's been 5 years with little to no progress in ending the war there. Reports from Mozambique say insurgents have not been pushed far out of the two gas districts of Palma, Mocimboa, Praia and Nangade. If this civil war continues, what would that mean for Mozambique as a whole? Well, let's unpack the latest now and look ahead with Liesl Louw-Vaudran, senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, who's been watching and following those developments in Mozambique for quite some time now and has spoken to us before here on Today about the situation in Cabo Delgado. Good afternoon, Liesl. Welcome to Today. Thanks for your time once again. I just saw a report earlier this week, a few days ago, that there's been more fighting and even SADC soldiers have been killed.
Yes, good afternoon, Dan. It is true that a soldier from Botswana was killed in those attacks in Nangade, actually north, close to the Tanzanian border. But this has been ongoing. You know, there's been almost every week 1 or 2 attacks, small villages, people being beheaded, people having to flee. I mean, the UN statistics show there are almost 900,000 people now displaced in Cabo Delgado. So really, it is a dire situation. But in terms of, you know, the response, it has been 5 years, but it's literally only been 18 months for the Rwandan soldiers that have been deployed there in July 2021. And then Samim actually was on the ground around September. So the Southern African Development Community troops, mostly South African and others. So, you know, it hasn't been that long. Unfortunately, we see in other parts of the continent that these kind of violent extremist threats are extremely difficult to contain. If you think of the Sahel, for example, it's been more than 10 years that there have been troops on the ground, French troops, UN troops, troops from the region, like with Boko Haram, for example. That was since 2014. So while we are very impatient, gains have been made. I think we must also bear in mind how difficult it is to fight this kind of threat.
Yeah, and I saw last week news coming out that the EU is approving from its peace fund hundreds of millions of rands to Rwanda to support the Rwandan presence in northern Cabo Delgado province.
Yes, it's true. I mean, they now have 2,500 troops and police. They are mostly protecting the liquid natural gas sites along the coast in Palma, Mocimboa, Praia, those areas. And now the problem is those areas are now increasingly safer. There are people that have been able to return, but and we are hoping that the liquid natural gas operations that were on land will, in the beginning of next year, maybe be able to return in that economic activity. But the insurgents are then sort of chased inland where the other troops are. Then, you know, there are skirmishes and attacks, as we've discussed. So the European Union assistance to Rwanda is quite controversial because we know that this deployment by Rwanda was almost, you know, it was a bilateral arrangement between Mozambique and Rwanda. Rwanda is not part of SADC. There have been very few discussions at SADC level with Rwanda. So now you have the Southern African troops in one area, the Rwandan troops in another area. Ideally, this should have been one response. And one coordinated response. And so now the EU is also funding Samim. They have given 15 million euros, but there was 1.9 million euros that came through the African Peace Facility through the AU. So the European Union is in fact giving a lot of money to Mozambique. More than 230 million euros are counted. If you look at what they're doing in terms of training, humanitarian aid, and then aid to all these military forces. But the Rwandan deployment has been successful, but it's kind of controversial. And you know that President Paul Kagame is in big trouble now in Eastern DRC and so on. So Politically, it would have been better if it was better coordinated, I think.
Yeah, let's bring it closer home. South Africa is part of that SADC mission that's on the ground there. And I can't remember the amount, but a few months ago, President Ramaphosa in Parliament responding to a question about South Africa's presence there and asking for an extension at some point, he was mentioning a very hefty figure of over 100 million rand.
Yes, close to 2 billion, I think, is what was initially requested for the total deployment there in Cabo Delgado. It's extremely costly, these kind of military operations. And we have over 1,000 troops there now, together with Lesotho, Tanzania, and Botswana. And that we know that it is to prevent the spread of violent extremism, which is extremely dangerous, throughout the Southern African region or northwards towards Tanzania and so on. But also South Africans have got a lot of investment. There are many South Africans sitting in Pemba or in the capital Maputo, waiting for these liquid natural gas operations to restart so that they can, get back to business. So it was also from the South African perspective, kind of a business decision. And liquid natural gas has now completely become so valuable in Europe and other places where, they're no longer receiving the Russian gas. We saw actually very recently, Dan, the first shipments of liquid natural gas from Cabo Delgado from the offshore platform to Europe. And it's the Italian project. That's a smaller project than the one that was suspended due to the Palma attacks. That's the French project. So South Africa is there and other countries are there as well.
And South Africa will continue to be there.
Yes, definitely as long as Rwanda is there, I think for political reasons. Also South Africa and some will be there, but we are really in it for the long haul. I definitely think so. And there's a lot of discussion around airlift capabilities, around getting better equipment into Cabo Delgado, but as you know, and we've discussed before, we also have to look at radicalization, dialogue, etc. in the region. It's not only a military response.
Yeah, and then the victims, they're on the ground, are still waiting for justice because there's been so much abuse there. Humanitarian crisis, as you say, the UN saying nearly 900,000 people have been displaced. Just to situate it in the context of some other conflicts in Africa, I'm not making a comparison, Liesl, but you said this is going to be a long-term conflict. It's not going to finish anytime soon. If you look at northeastern Nigeria, where Boko Haram, for years now, has been causing terror there. Should Southern Africa brace itself that the Cabo Delgado conflict is going to be similar into the future, that it's not going to end anytime soon until a proper political solution is established?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. A political solution and dialogue and bringing these having a rule of law solution, also bringing some of the perpetrators of these acts to justice, which has not been the case actually all over the continent. We have this kind of violent extremist threat. It's a war, it's just a military response. You don't see the government or the multinational forces actually taking that moral high ground. You asked the question about Boko Haram. It is a little different. I mean, in the way it has evolved and the way the responses were, I think Boko Haram also had a very strong ideological base, ethnic base also around, northeastern Nigeria, that whole region on the Lake Chad Basin, the Kanuri-speaking people that are basically being marginalized. And so you have other factors. You have the religious factor, the ethnic factors, and then, this strong ideological base. And then the way the Nigerian military also initially acted almost exacerbated the whole issue. And you have Niger, which is a really weak state, and Chad and Cameroon and so on. So it's quite different. And I would say the key, and we've written also at the ISS for solving this, is also making sure that Tanzania and that border between Cabo Delgado and Tanzania needs to be, patrolled, and make sure that that is not a route where supplies and personnel and so on, or recruits from the Islamic State can come through. These other places like the Sahel and so on, they're completely ungoverned spaces. So the borders are completely porous borders. If you look at the Sahel, for example, Algeria, Libya, where all the arms are coming from, there's hardly, so you have almost hostile states or ungoverned spaces bordering on these areas. Now, with Cabo Delgado, it's not the case. It is easier to contain it in a way because of that.
Okay,
and
thanks for pointing. Yeah, no, thanks for pointing out the differences.
But it's not exactly the same.
Yeah. Yes, but it's possible to contain it. It shouldn't spread around beyond Cabo Delgado in Southern Africa. Thank you very much for your insights and your time this hour here on Today on ENCA. Liesl Louw-Vaudran, a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, as we were reflecting a bit on what's been going on in northern Mozambique.